Today we're going to look at Recon Model Viewer, and more specifically at how to import your 3D models and textures into the Recon Resource Manager. All assets that you want to use inside Recon has to be inside the Resource Manager. The Resource Manager will take all your assets and process them so that they are ready to be used inside the Recon environment. The first thing you want to do is to create a new workspace. I prefer to use a central location, in this case called Workspaces, and inside my Workspaces folder I create new subfolders for each workspace that I make. And in this case I'm going to call it Demo Workspace, and once I've created it I'll go ahead and select it and then give my workspace the name Demo Workspace. Click OK and it'll generate your workspace. Once you created your workspace, you can head over to the Resource Manager, and in the Resource Manager is where we'll be adding our models and textures. So we right click and create a new folder, and in this case we're going to call it Dropships, which will be the folder to which we're going to import the models and textures. And you can import individual files at a time, or in this case we can import a whole folder at once. So basically go ahead and select the folder that contains your models and textures, and Recon will import them into the Resource Manager. Once imported, they will appear in your resource view. You get an options dialog which allows you to choose what types of content you want to import. In this case, we're only importing 3DS models. It is always a good idea to save the workspace once you've imported models and textures, and you can simply do that by going to Workspace and Save Workspace. The next step will be to process all the content. This will convert all the models and textures into a Recon ready format, and we can do this by asking the Resource Manager simply to build everything. This is not necessary. Recon has an on-demand compiler, so whenever you use a resource that has not yet been converted, it will be automatically compiled by the on-demand compiler. And as you can see, the moment you build something, it switches to the build output window, and in the build output window you can see if you had any errors while building your resources. One can always go back and change settings for a specific asset, and in this case I'm just going to bake the transforms or remove any scale, and then just click on the reprocess button again, and this will rebuild the particular asset. And if successful, I can then simply go back and now open this model in the scene by right clicking on it and selecting Open in Scene. Now with the model open in the scene, I'm just going to go ahead and right click and set my navigation mode to orbit selection. Thus when I control left click drag, I can now orbit around my model, which makes it much easier to navigate. With the model selected, I can go ahead and click on different subparts of the model, and a green wireframe indicates that I have a subpart selected, and I can go to the Materials tab and have a look at which textures and shader have been applied to the specific subpart of the model. I'm going to go ahead and assign a normal map now to the normal map slot of the blend shader, and we also have a specular map slot for the blend shader, and I'm going to assign a specular shader, or rather a specular texture, and we now have a normal map. The normal map in this case is not very prominent, but sometimes that's a good thing, and I can now rotate my model and adjust my specular settings to get it to a setting which I like. So what I'll do is just do a few rotations to get an idea of the current specular highlights, and as you can see there's not a lot of it, so I'll go ahead and tweak a few of the blend shader specular parameters, and again after tweaking one can just rotate and see if you're happy with the look and feel. It is then also possible to basically switch your render mode to specular mode, and by doing so it'll only show the specular highlights on your model. So you can't see the diffuse channel at all, and you'll only see the light specular interaction with your model. And there are various different modes that you can view. You can, for instance, view world space normals, which gives you an idea of what the normals look like in world space, and this takes into account the normals map you assigned. You can switch to view space normals, which is basically from the view vantage point. And then there are all sorts of other different view modes. I'm not going to go through them all right now. You can do wireframe mode. Wireframe mode just gives you an idea of the complexity of your mesh. And then, of course, you can also go ahead and change the color of the wireframe to a color that suits you better, or that's more appropriate for your needs. And then there's also a mode called wireframe overlay, which will draw a wireframe overlay on all meshes, regardless whether they're selected or not. And that's also good for debugging complexity of your scene. And if you have level of detail, you can actually see it switching more clearly between different levels of detail when you have overlay wireframe mode enabled. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add another model to the resource manager, and this time it's an FBX model, which is just a simple plane, which is going to act as the ground beneath our spaceship. And I'm just going to do a few parameter adjustments to remove the inherent scale and Bakewell transforms. That just ensures that we have a normalized size when we open up this model in the scene. And when I say open in scene, it's going to on-demand compile it as it's not been processed before. And now it's opening the scene, and as you can see, it has no textures or like diffuse or normal maps assigned to it. And I'm just going to go ahead now and switch off the wireframe overlay mode and just switch back to normal render mode. I'm now going to assign a diffuse and normal map texture to the plane mesh. Every time you create a new workspace, it makes available a few default textures that's available inside the workspace. And assigning textures is as easy as selecting the mesh, going to the resource manager, clicking on or right-clicking on the specific texture, and assigning it to the appropriate map slot. So we've now assigned a dark gray diffuse, and next I'm going to assign the normals map texture to the normals map slot. And we are going to keep the current default specular map. Next I'm going to scale the plane because it's a bit small. I want to make it larger so it gives us a bit of infinity. And I also now need to rescale the UV coordinates to an appropriate size. At the moment, the spaceship is intersecting with the ground plane, so I'm going to select the spaceship and use the transform tool to translate the spaceship upward, and so it sits nicely on the ground plane. I'm now going to add a light, but I first want to make a few adjustments to the environment settings. I want to make it dark, and I also want to adjust the ambient values. On the environment tab, you can enable or disable the environment by unchecking or checking the enabled checkbox. This will turn off the sky or turn it on. And you can also change the time of day. In this case, I want to make it dark, and I can also choose to switch off the night sky. And I want to make adjustments to the ambient values. You have a low and high ambient value, a minimum or maximum rather, and the environment system uses that to interpolate as the daytime changes in your simulation. When adding lights, it's good to always get a view that's going to correspond to the position and direction of the light that you're going to add. Because in Recon, whenever you add a light, it's added from the viewpoint of the camera. You can always later switch to the light view to adjust or navigate the light as if it was a camera, or you can translate the light like any other object in your scene. At the moment you can see hard edges from the light cone's perspective, and we can change that by just adding a fall-off value of 1. Will give us a nice radial cone or a radial fall-off on the light. And we can also go ahead and adjust the intensity of light, and as well as change the color of the light by clicking on the light color box, which will open up the light color. But first, let's just delete the grid. We don't need it anymore. And we can select objects obviously by clicking on them in the scene, or selecting them from the level tree view on the left hand side. So I'm now going to go ahead and adjust the color of the light, and we can have a nice cool color, or we can go and make it a bit of a warmer color. I also want to reduce the bloom intensity because it's a bit much at the moment. So I can simply go to the Post Effects tab, and I can do a few things. I can reduce the blur radius on the bloom, and I can also reduce the bloom intensity. And if I'm happy with my current light setup, I can get rid of the light cone, because it can become irritating to have the light cone lights or light cone lines visible in the scene the whole time as you're working. So you can go ahead and select the light, and right at the bottom of the light parameters we can just switch or uncheck the visible checkbox, and that gets rid of the light cone lines. Another nice feature that helps you showcase your models is the camera animation keyframe system. You can click on the camera tab, and in the keyframe tab you can just hit the plus sign, and that'll add a keyframe. Then go ahead, adjust your camera, hit plus sign again, and so forth and so forth, and this will add a range of keyframes for your camera to animate. You can use the WASD keys on your keyboard to navigate, and you can also use the middle mouse wheel to zoom in and out if you want to. So once you're done adding all your keys, you can then go ahead and save the keys for later use, or you can just simply go ahead and click on play, and it'll show you the animation you've just created. You can obviously also select individual keyframes and delete them if you want to, or you can select a keyframe and make adjustments by entering different values in the available parameters. Now, another nice thing about the camera keyframing is it allows you to switch between different render modes while the keyframe animation is being played, so you can investigate things like your specular maps and your specular highlights to make sure that they are adequate under most or all camera view angles. At the moment the spaceship has a black and white specular map, and I want to give it a bit more of a metallic shine, so I'll go ahead and cheat and use the diffuse map as a specular map. In reality you would want to adjust it a bit, but I've just assigned the diffuse map to the specular channel, and looking at the specular map now, you should see some color appear on the specular map channel, and this will allow us to give us a bit more of a metallic shader or a metallic look by still using a simple blend shader. I want to change the cockpit canopy to give it transparency and some reflection, and the first thing I'm going to do is assign a different shader to the canopy submesh part of the model. Now if I go to my default effect material shaders, I can see a range of default shaders, and I think in this case I'm going to select the Gooch shader because I like the color toning a good shader causes on transparent objects. So we can see the shader changed, but there's no reflection, and we haven't assigned any diffuse textures on it. So I'm going to go ahead and assign a dark gray texture as diffuse, and I'm also going to assign a environment map as reflection on the cockpit canopy. We don't have any alpha channel on the dark gray texture assigned to the canopy, but we can see now that we have a environment reflection going on the canopy. The next thing we need to do is we need to specify the blend modes for the cockpit submesh part. So we're going to enable transparency and alpha blending. And because it's a dark gray diffuse texture, we can use the source color and inverse source color to do the blending for the source and destination blend modes respectively. And as you can see, we now have transparency and reflection on the cockpit canopy. And finally, if we are happy with everything, we can go ahead and save the level, and this will allow us to load this level again at a later stage.